Our first speaker, Stephan, who's the CEO of Inerjys Ventures, will share his work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sure. So I'm so honored, so happy to be here, and frankly so excited to be here to talk to you about what we're doing up in Canada in Inerjys. Our commitment is to deploy $1 billion over the next 7 years in clean energy technology and financing. But we're doing it through a growth equity fund with a twist. We're trying to be a little bit disruptive. I've been disruptive for the last 17 years of my career. I may say things that some of you may disagree with, so I invite challenges at the end. But this is the problem we're trying to tackle. Climate change is a big deal. This is an image that was taken only last week. As you see, the Arctic sea ice is shrinking at a historic rate. It's getting worse and worse. So if we don't tackle this problem at the core, the biggest problems here, we're going to be facing some pretty disastrous consequences. Let's see where the carbon emissions come from. They mostly come from the energy sector. That means that even if we replaced every car on the road with an electric vehicle, we wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, certainly not fast enough, if we don't tackle energy, the energy infrastructure in the world. And if we look at the energy industry, we see a very disturbing thing, which is that for all of the hype, for all the talk about clean energy technology, for all of the airport advertisements we see with pretty wind turbines and wonderful solar panels, it's only 3% of the global market. That means we're not dealing with the problem. Why aren't we dealing with the problem? You know, in my experience, I come traditionally, or my history is from the telecom sector, and I saw some pretty hyper growth in the telecom and ICT sector. I'm Canadian, so I like hockey sticks. I saw a hockey stick of growth. We're not seeing that because innovations aren't generating the kind of cost efficiencies that we need in order for it to make financial sense. At the same time, we have to look at the markets. We have to understand the addressable market. Do you know, in telecom 20 years ago, if you were in London, it was inconceivable that you could make a call other than through BT. And yet dial the clock a few years forward and you could stroll down Oxford Street and choose from 15 different communications players. Why don't we have that in energy? When the market in telecom opened up, we saw a wider addressable market generating all kinds of innovation infrastructure investments. That's what needs to happen in energy as well at scale. Now, who is normally responsible for real disruptive innovations? It's usually the VCs. Take it from me, I've been dealing with VCs my whole life. Not always easy. VCs are shying away from the heavier parts of clean tech. As an asset class, they haven't made money. They talk about it a lot. So even though here at CGI we hear a lot of great examples of things that are working, they would call it niche. They would call it not profitable. We're not attacking the problem. Banks and private equity funds, similarly, are very risk averse. So we have to understand that. Markets, on the market side, we have to look at the regulatory environment and allow for multiple new alternative energy players to come in. And so what's the winning formula? Well, what we're trying to do is to take what were two separate worlds, the world of utilities and energy generation and retailing, and the world of supply chain, the world of the equipment that goes into those projects, and bring them together. So this vehicle, this growth equity fund that is called Inerjys, we're advocating as a model, and we hope so many others will join, is bringing those two asset classes together. We do growth equity investing in companies that have products that are doing clean energy more efficiently. But at the same time, we're investing in projects, utility-grade projects in clean energy around the world. And so here's the idea. It's a very simple idea. You see lean burn over there? The biggest problem that we found in the world of tech, the one that the VCs were failing to make profits on, is the companies that they were funding were taking round after round of funding, but the revenues were hard to come by. And so the model of investing from the same fund into a project and a product company is very deliberate so that you could deliver revenues from the projects to the product companies. So the product companies could grow organically, sustainably, in a healthy way without using over-dilutive funding. Now, assuming that we have these great innovative companies growing on their own revenues with references, strategic investors into the fund are very, very important as well, because these multinational corporations are needed to act as resellers, as distributors, as OEM partners for those smaller companies. On the branding side, why can't we have the Vodafone of clean energy? Why is it that we can have in telecom a 200-country-strong branded utility company who has leverage over its suppliers? Ericsson shakes in its boots when Vodafone calls. Why can't we have that in energy? Think about it. The only branded energy companies you can think of are usually petroleum companies. Why don't we have a service provider which is global and branded? If we had that, not just one called Inerjys, but many of them, the market would change. The regulatory environment would follow suit. Now, global utilities are also going to rely on public-private partnerships. One of the things that really excites me about CGI is this advocacy of public-private partnerships. And so at Inerjys, we really extended a hand out to the Canadian government, to the Quebec government, and in Canada, $400 million in the last federal budget was put towards fund investing, with a recognition that that government money could be best served to stimulate job creation and energy leadership in Canada by putting it in the hands of fund managers who are doing innovative things. And so I'm quite proud of that as a Canadian. Similarly in Quebec, because in Canada we get to be Quebecer and Canadian at the same time, in Quebec we have a wonderfully supportive government as well, which has been investing directly into funds. And so governments getting involved and with their regulatory environment as well are very important. This will generate yields for funds. And if we generate yields, more LPs and institutionals and pensions that ran away will come back. Copycats, scale. And so the takeaways that I want you to leave here with from my sort of idea is that finance is a human construct. Why do things in finance have to be so rigid? This is from the perspective of a serial entrepreneur who got into the finance game after years of building things and being disruptive. I don't understand why things always have to fit into buckets. The chairman of a large global bank told me one time, "Great idea, I love it, it's exactly what we need to do." I said, "Great, why don't you invest in our fund?" He said, "Well, we just don't do that." So public and private coming together is a powerful thing. Scale is going to follow from sustainable business plans, and impact is going to come when we have that kind of scale. So thank you very much. I invite you to get in touch with us and to further the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So again, as we start to get ready for this conversation, think about some of the themes that Stephan brought up. Why not? Am I on? Yes.
First of all, you were asking how do you get that 400 times, or how do you get those multipliers, right? In the fund world, you need to be able to make enough 10x's, let's say 10x, more than 400x. You need to make enough 10x's to mitigate all of the ones that didn't do well, because you're always going to have some failures. The only way to get 10x's is to have scarcity value, to have the kind of intellectual property that others don't have, and to not get into trouble where you're constantly chasing the next round of funding and you dilute the company so much that in the end nobody's running the ship. So to parlay that into your other earlier question, which is where did you fail, where were the difficulties, you'd be very surprised how difficult it is to raise a fund. Raising a fund in this environment is historically tough. And I hear a lot of people understanding that. And the statistic that bothers me the most as a person raised a fund is how un-Darwinian it is. It's survival of the unfittest. The ones who have performed the worst are the ones who get the most money. Why is that? Because it seems safer to invest in groups that have worked together before, who can show historic relationships with institutions. And it seems not logical to the layman, but that's what's happening. Yeah. So these are difficulties that I banged my head against for a long time. Yeah. But you get through it. You just persevere.
Well, we've already heard some nice stories about partnering and portfolio, but it doesn't happen that often, right? I mean, the challenges of partnering and doing this stuff, what would it take to do that more? I love when people bring up Darwin, because in Darwin's writing, he wrote about survival of the fittest twice. And he talks about cooperation and love 98 times, right? And so what would it take to actually
You know
cooperate?
the company Solyndra everybody talks so much about on the campaign trail?
Yeah.
Solyndra is an example, and many other examples, of companies that took hundreds of millions of dollars but couldn't get to revenue. And when I look at investment classes that have been more successful than others, VCs did very badly. Angel investors did very well. They outperformed VCs. Why is that? It's their own money. They have thicker skins. They don't turn on management teams at a moment's notice to put in puppets. There's a lot of reasons why angels have done better than institutional investors. What I am trying to advocate here on this stage is let's take what angels do and apply it to scale with larger amounts. Let's keep companies leaner, give them less money, and make them obsessed about where tomorrow's revenue is coming from, and not just revenue, profit margins, and not just profit margins, but sustainable over time. If we do that, instead of worrying about big funding rounds and hiring 150 people and having big trade show booths, then our companies will be healthier, and their shareholders, thank you, their shareholders will make money because the acquirers will come buy them for a multiple for a very simple reason, because they won't have to sell themselves. When you're in the black, you'll sell yourself for 5 or 10x, and that's what we're not doing in the world of clean energy.
Either on this conversation or the work.
Closing thoughts. You know when you're walking onto the airplane, you see those HSBC ads, aren't they cool? You ever see the one that says there's enough sun in North Africa to power all of Europe for an entire year or whatever it is? That one really drives me crazy. Because if it's the case, why aren't we doing it? Well, there's a project called Desert Tech that some of you may be aware of that's been kind of languishing for many, many, many years in the planning phases. And it's in the planning phases forever. One of the biggest problems now that we sort of reduce the cost of solar panels is how do you get it to Europe from North Africa? Well, if you underlay under the Mediterranean cables, it's very expensive. And aside from the cost, you have the potential security risk that some Al-Qaeda cell would come up and bomb it after you finished building it, and that's also a problem. So how do you do this? Now, out-of-the-box thinking, we found a really cool solution where you could take bauxite, a mineral which can be heated next to a solar, installation by a port in North Africa to a certain temperature where it becomes kind of like a really big battery. Then you float it on a barge to Europe and you drain it of its battery because it's rechargeable. You drain it of its energy and you float it back. So here you're kind of running a ferry service. These types of solutions exist. We can tackle climate change if we have the courage to take some risk, to think out of the box, and to pressure the banking and financial institutions to come along with us and not be so scared of innovations. Because that's the only way we're going to stop relying on government subsidies as a crutch. That's the only way. So I hope we can all do it together.
Thank you.